Awesome. So yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming to listen. So yeah, if you don't know me, my name is Matt Coulter, and I'm a senior architect in Liberty Mutual, now specifically focused on sort of global developer experience enablement. And rather than having like a big slide where I'm going to talk through me and introduce myself, I've dotted throughout the slide deck why you should probably be interested in the Liberty Mutual opinion here. So what we're going to talk about today is well-architected, serverless-first development, and with a flavor of AWS CDK. And the flow of the way we're going to go through this, I'm going to explain what serverless is and how that differs from serverless-first, because I think there's a lot of confusion there traditionally. I'll explain the AWS Well Architected Framework, what a well-architected review is, and then we can start jumping into what AWS CDK is and how it compares to some of the other options that are out there in the market. And then finally, we can get into some things like combining CDK patterns with well-architected reviews, well-architected constructs. And then because I ran out of space with the amount of things I'm trying to cover, you'll just have to stay tuned for what further resources means. So first of all, what is serverless? And this is where I think we keep saying serverless needs a new term in 2022, because I think it's confusing to a lot of people now based on it's been around for a long time. And the easiest way I can describe this of why the term's confusing, it's if I pick on AWS Lambda just a wee bit. Because if this was 2019 and I had a big room of people and I asked, what does serverless mean AWS Lambda? The answer was always yes. The answer was always the goal is to shift everything to Lambda. And Lambda was always, it was just Lambda, Lambda, Lambda. No matter what you did, that's where everybody focused. But the actual truth is in 2022, it's not just Lambda. And Lambda isn't even the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of serverless now is actually Lambda-less or functionless architectures. Lambda is what you use as the glue between two pieces that don't directly connect. So it's time to stop being so obsessed with AWS Lambda, unfortunately. Sorry, Chris Mons, if you're listening. Now, if it's not Lambda, what is it? Well, serverless is more than Lambda, and it has this official icon that I only found out this week. That's the cloud with the infinity logo. I at first thought it was an Infinidash joke from Corey Quinn last year, but it turns out this is the official logo. And this spectrum of capabilities that you're seeing, I took this from the official AWS PowerPoint deck that has all the icons for all their services. So if you're sitting thinking you've missed a bunch of services, the link on the bottom left for aws.amazon.com/serverless, submit feedback there to say they've missed services, because this is what they've listed. But the idea for serverless is it's not just one thing, it's a capability that you're taking advantage of that's in the cloud. So for example, here, compute, that just means you want to perform something. You just want to run some code, and that's it. And that's where AWS Lambda comes in. Runs your code, and then it closes down. Where it gets a bit confusing now in this diagram is Lambda now supports container images. So Lambda could technically fit in the next column as well. But if you want to run a container image like persistent running, that's where AWS Fargate is the most serverless container offering for persistent containers. Then it gets more interesting in application integration, because this is where it's talking about capabilities like SQS for queues, SNS for notifications/events. Event Bridge is your bus, where all of those events flow through that you can write rules to decide where your events go and what actions to take on them. And then step functions is complex orchestration logic backed by things like retries, dead letter queues, and all of your logging built in out of the box. Then you've AppSync for GraphQL and API Gateway for REST APIs. And when I say REST, I mean the industry definition REST, because it's split into REST APIs and HTTP APIs, but that's a whole different argument. For storage, Amazon S3, everybody knows it. You can just put things in the cloud and it'll keep them there at a cheap price. And then databases, you've a few different options. You've DynamoDB, which is your classic NoSQL database, or RDS Proxy for connecting to a database, and Amazon Aurora Serverless. So the point is there's a lot of serverless options that are all very different, as well as a bunch of services at reInvent that launched that included the word serverless in their description. And it's got really confusing to people what it means if you say you've got a serverless service. So that's where I say it's 4 things. The first thing is AWS says it's rapid speed to production. A serverless offering, you should be able to, through infrastructure as code, just pick it up, put it out there, and it shouldn't take hours or days. It should be, like spinning up a DynamoDB table takes seconds, if not minutes max. It should also be massively scalable. Now, I used to say infinitely scalable, but we've proven that's not true. So it's massively scalable, surrounded by your AWS account limits. But the point is, if you build on a serverless architecture, by the time you hit your limits, you should be talking millions of users, as opposed to thinking, a small server on your desk that maybe 100 people could bring it over. The next thing that's super important is pay only for what you use. So it's not a flat rate. It's a different way of actually charging back and projecting what it's going to cost for your business. But it means when things happen, like a global pandemic, and maybe you've less customers, your costs just scale right down, and it can keep you in business. And then the last one, it's all about writing less code and having more direct integrations. And I mean that both inside and outside of AWS. Serverless is about connecting things together whilst writing the least amount of code to do it. And that's what it's always been. That's actually what Lambda was on day one. It's the glue between 2 AWS services because they didn't connect directly. And you've seen over years, you can now do API gateway to step function. Step function can connect into an external API, or it can connect into something else. They're joining all the dots so that you don't need to write all of the code anymore. And something I'm not trying to gatekeep, I really just wanted to call this out. Lambda is a serverless technology, but like anything, what you do with it isn't necessarily serverless, and that's okay. It's just, I think this is where it confuses people, because it offers container images now, you could put anything in that container. I mean, think of the wide spectrum of things that you can run on a container. So if you stood up, I don't know, a Kubernetes cluster inside a Lambda function, you're probably not going to set serverless anymore. And it's okay, just own your solution. It might work for you, but I just think that's where it confuses people. You got to separate. Lambda is serverless, but what you do with it isn't necessarily. It's a bit like if you bought an electric car and you said you're saving the planet, but then you buy a petrol generator to charge it, people are going to ask a few questions, but it's still an electric car. And just to point out, so why should you take Liberty's opinion on this, or my opinion? Well, there's a good story that you can read on the AWS serverless site that's a case study of Liberty Mutual and some of the benefits we've got from serverless over the past couple of years. So that's just amazon.com/serverless right out there. So that's serverless as a technology. But what about serverless first? Because surely it's the same thing, right? Well, unfortunately not. So serverless first starts with a mindset. And the mindset is, everybody knows I say, code is a liability. With the less code that you maintain, you can focus on business value. And what this means, without all the fancy terms, is if you have a competitor that, whenever something like Log4j happens, has to spend 2-3 weeks 100% focused on refactoring all their code bases to strip out that piece of code liability, but you're 100% reliant on AWS provided offerings, where Amazon teams are scrambling behind the scenes to remove that code liability. With all that extra time, you can go out and understand the market, understand what the customers need, and build the feature that brings in extra business. And that's the point. It's about having that trade-off of all of this code is a liability. All of it takes time for us to keep secure, maintain it, and keep it up to date. So which liability do we want to own? And I didn't really say serverless, so how is that related, given it's called serverless first? Well, the whole underlying thing of serverless technology is that it shifts this undifferentiated heavy lifting to the cloud provider, because you're just saying, I want a queue, I want to send events, I want storage, but you don't need to particularly care about how it happens. You just have a contract with the cloud that they give you that thing, you pay this amount of money. And where people get tripped up, and this is the most singular important thing to understand when talking about serverless first. Serverless first is not the same as serverless only, because unless your business is brand spanking new, just started on this call, you had code before today. And that code might be bringing in billions of dollars, but it might also be written in something else that isn't compatible with serverless. So it's not about going in and saying we're going to rewrite everything. It's about understanding where serverless can help your business and can help you evolve. And to do that, you need to understand that not all code is equal. It's just the truth. You need to have that decision for every single piece of code that you own. How much business dollar value does this produce? And how much does it cost us to keep this going? And what is the potential to reduce that cost? Or what is the potential to optimize that value? That's what you need to know to understand serverless first. And again, going back to that, it's not just sort of all in or all out. You have to use a technique that we sort of call falling back to the right option. So whenever you're trying to solve a problem, the serverless first mindset is you start with the most serverless option, which ironically is the do nothing. And then you keep falling back to owning more code liability until you find the Goldilocks solution, until you understand that this is the right implementation to solve this problem with this code that we want to keep around. So that's the falling back option, I don't think is well communicated or understood. And to try and explain it a bit better, I took this image from reInvent 2018. Now this isn't perfect because number one, it's from 2018, so it's missing some of the services that exist today. But number two, this is just a technology spectrum. It doesn't include other things, so I'll get into that in a minute. But to demonstrate my point here, on the left, it talks about more operations. Going over to the right, which it says less operations. And Lambda is on the far right. So you might have a particular piece of code you want to run. So you try to fit it in the Lambda. But after doing your research, you discover Lambda just doesn't fit. It's not going to work. Well, the serverless first attitude isn't to just put it in there anyway and say that you've used Lambda. It's to try and fall back to Fargate, put it in a container and see if Fargate meets your needs. But at that point, if for whatever reason Fargate isn't performant enough, I don't know, you keep falling back to ECS or EKS, to EC2, until eventually you've fallen back to on-prem. And that's, again, okay, because at that point, you completely understand why that piece of code needs to run on-prem. You understand why the other solutions didn't work. And you can either write a strategy to mitigate why it didn't work, or you can just accept it and say, this piece of code, this is what it costs. It has to run on-prem. But you've got all that context and you understand that you've used the right technology to solve the right problem, but starting with the most serverless and falling back. The reason why I say the last diagram isn't perfect is because, as I said, only covered technology. But serverless first architectures, they're serviceful. I don't know if there's one L or two L's in serviceful or if it's even a word, but I'm just going with it. So the idea behind this is you can write this really generic infrastructure like this, completely made up one, that you can have an API gateway protected by a firewall that integrates directly with a step function where all of your secret sauce lives. This is where everything to do with what makes you a business is sitting and why you're either winning or failing in a market. That's where the logic is. And it can orchestrate to external services, to internal services, to anything. It can hook it all in, do your business logic, and provide the outcome to your users that they expect. And everything outside of that yellow box, to you, it's a commodity. You're not paying, like you'll pay a price to use it, but you're not paying for the ongoing maintenance and liability and making sure it's patched. You just have contracts with them, so you can focus 100% in that yellow box. And that's the goal of serverless first. And it's not about the technology, it's about understanding your business processes so that that's where you focus. So you might be thinking, so far this sounds a bit preachy and that I haven't told you how to do any of this. I've just been like, okay, you want to focus on reducing liability. You want to understand the cost of your code. Well, let's tell you how to do it. We use a technique called Wordley mapping. And we love Wordley mapping in Liberty because it's a phenomenal way of actually understanding this stuff. So this is a map, and it was invented by the man on the right, Simon Wardley. That's his Twitter, and that's the Medium link to understand how to Wordley map yourself. But this map is made up of the y-axis. This is your value chain, and the further up the value chain you are, the closer to the customer you are, closer to the end user, the more they'll care if you change whatever that is. Whereas if you're way down the bottom, you're invisible to the end user. So that could be completely critical to your business, but the end user won't care if you swap it out or how much you spend on it or whatever, because it's invisible to them. On the x-axis, it starts at Genesis, which means this is the first time anyone in the world has ever done this before. It's revolutionary. It's going to change the world. Very few things should be here. Then the next one is custom built, where you're saying there's a product that could solve your problem, but you think there's value for your business in custom building something different. Then product is sort of, as the name implies, there's multiple different options. You can just rent or buy a product to solve this problem. And then commodity is, as long as you have that thing, you don't really care where it comes from, like electricity. You could swap electric providers, but the only thing that changes is the bill. I mean, you might care in that you might want the more sustainable one, but to this overall map, it won't change it. It's still a commodity. And this map is of a cafe selling a cup of tea. So our user comes in and pays 55 cents to get a cup of tea, of which 5 cents goes back into the business. And then the rest of this map just breaks down everything needed to create a cup of tea based on all the components and where they sit on how visible it is to the user and how much of a commodity it is. So like a cup, you can get that from anywhere. Tea, again, it's not some special tea they've imported, it's just regular stuff. The staff is more of a product because people are more important than just a commodity, but anybody could pretty much do this job because they're just handing a cup. You also need hot water, which is composed of water and a kettle to heat the water, and the kettle needs power to heat it. So the interesting thing in this diagram is 15 cents of every transaction of 55 cents goes into the kettle, and only 5 goes to the power, which means 10 cents of every 55 cents is being spent on this custom built proprietary kettle technology. So the conversation you would have if you went in and drew this worldly map is you would be saying, what value to the end user does that kettle provide? You know, are people really coming to drink your tea just for that kettle, or does it just heat water? Because if all it does is heat water, you want to evolve that kettle to either a product or a commodity, take that extra money, invest it back into the business on something that the customers actually care about that can differentiate you. And you can do this exact same process with architectures. You just start at the top with the user and hit the first thing that they hit and start breaking it out from there. And you'll very quickly see the thing that's just a PC running under someone's desk somewhere is the thing sitting in custom built and invisible on the left. And that's where you can start having those conversations of serverless first, of where would this fit? And then you start falling back. So if you've never learned worldly maps, it's definitely something to really invest in, because this has been key for us understanding how to evolve. So that's serverless and serverless first. But once you decide to actually build something and you find the Goldilocks level of serverless, how do you build the right thing in the right way? Well, this is where the AWS Well Architected Framework comes in. It's built on 6 pillars now. It was 5 up until December. So it's got operational excellence, security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability. And I'll briefly go through my explanation. The official definition will be up there, but I'll give you the Matt Coulter interpretation. So operational excellence to me is, how do you know that your app is doing what you think it's doing before a customer calls you and says, yeah, this isn't working? It's just understanding what's happening in real time as the app is running. Security, it says what it does in the tin, or it does what it says in the tin. I should say it's protecting everything about access to the system as well as the data underlying it. Reliability is actually more interesting than you'd think from an AWS perspective, because a lot of people assume that AWS is up 100% of the time, but it does have some localized, as well as very rarely AWS itself goes down. So you need to have those conversations about, from a business perspective, what level of outage is acceptable for you, and then what level of infrastructure do you need to build so that whenever that level of outage happens on AWS, you stay up. Because not everybody needs multi-region failover for some simple apps, but if you're a Fortune 100, you might. So that's what the reliability pillar is about. Performance efficiency is, again, not necessarily about how fast can you make the system, but it's about how fast does the system need to be based on your business and what your customers desire. Because if you're running some kind of asynchronous process as a business, your customers won't care if it takes a bit longer. So you might actually not care about making it faster. Cost optimization sounds like it relates to performance in that you might think faster means cheaper because pay for what you use, but not always. Sometimes you can reduce the cost because things were over-optimized or were over-provisioned, but it doesn't make it any faster, but you've saved money. So this is about really understanding all the configuration you've got and the impact of that on your overall cloud bill. And then sustainability is really new, and it's really interesting in that it's thinking about the bigger picture. So this is everything to do with software development. It could be how long do you retain your actual build artifacts, and are you accidentally checking in your node modules? Because that's all stored in a data center somewhere for AWS. And that's taking electricity and power to keep that going. So it's bad for the planet. So can you optimize what your actual individual processes for the greater good? But it says brand new, so we're still waiting to see how it shakes out. Now these 6 pillars, they're explained through lenses. And these lenses are actually a white paper. So I'm trying not to throw too many terms at once here, but there's 13 white papers out there now. And the date back a few years, I can't remember when the first one was written, but there's also the original AWS Well Architected white paper. And a white paper solves a particular problem. So the ones you see, like games industry lens, but there's also ones like the serverless lens. And a white paper goes through and takes each of the well architected pillars and breaks it down for that very specific lens. So in the case of serverless, it'll go through and talk about, serverless applications interacting with non-serverless, or restricting access to API gateways. It talks about the technology you're going to use, and it tries to be helpful. You can think of these as the textbook for the cloud. So you can. And then the way you use all this information, the way you operationalize it, it's through a process called a well-architected review. And you use a tool in AWS called the AWS Well Architected tool. So we love well-architected reviews in Liberty. We've been doing them for a couple of years. And I actually thought it was hilarious because I don't remember giving this quote. But again, you should probably listen to how we do our well-architected reviews because we're listed on the well-architected page. So let's talk about it. What is a well-architected review and how should you use it? On face value, you go into the AWS console and you go into the well-architected tool. And you can just click define workload. And this allows you to pick whether you just want to do a full-blown well-architected review, or if you want to pick a specific lens like serverless. And the image on the right is the serverless lens. And the way it works is it just goes through each of the pillars and it asks you questions relating to each of the best practices that AWS thinks you should have. So that one there, Ops 1, how do you evaluate your serverless application's health? And it goes through with checkboxes saying like, I understand and alert on metrics provided out of the box, or I use distributed tracing, or I have structured logging. But so it's really on base value, the well-architected tool is pretty, I'll either say simple or unhelpful, but I think that's because maybe we don't use it for maybe the way people think it should. So it's not a tool to go to and use if you're inexperienced, because you could just check all the checkboxes and say you're good. That's not what the tool is for, to me. It's an opportunity for me to go and help a team that's building serverless applications but doesn't necessarily have the full breadth of experience. So I can run this review and I can ask these questions and I can delve into, whenever they give me an answer, I can probe a bit more and get more context. And this is how we have those conversations structured in a consistent manner. Because if you don't have that consistency, it can end up you just talk about an architecture diagram for an hour and a half and don't really get anywhere. And it's not just a conversation. So the well-architected reviews produce a well-architected report. And again, these are interesting because you can set up your AWS accounts that all well-architected reports can be accessible from a centralized account, because if you do this through the console, so whatever account you're in at the time is where your well-architected review is going to happen. But you can set it up that all reports are accessible from a central account. And then they have well-architected APIs that you can do a ton of cool stuff on top of. But for the purpose of this, it's interesting because this is a snapshot in time. So after you complete a well-architected review, it produces not just a PDF with everything that you talked about, but it has this report with milestones, and it records for each of the pillars high and medium risks that were identified through this process. So if we did a review for a team now, I'd immediately be seeing there's 3 high-risk security pillars right there. And the team would have to take that themselves with their product owner and with their architect or whoever and decide how to mitigate those. But if we do another well-architected review in 3 months, I would expect that 3 to be 0 at that point, whether it means they've accepted the risk or whether it means that they fixed the risk. But the point is you can track and plot team progress over time instead of it just being a conversation that happens once and goes away. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of what is serverless, what is not serverless, serverless first, the well-architected framework and well-architected reviews in 26 minutes, not bad. Let's talk about AWS CDK. So what is AWS CDK? I took this directly from the website. So if you disagree, again, find a report on this page. You use the AWS CDK to define your cloud resources in a familiar programming language. So today that means you can use JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java, C#, and Go is now in developer preview. And I'm not sure how close that is to GA. I heard it was pretty close, but I haven't used it personally. So if you're saving that for the Q&A, I'll preempt it. And the way I like to describe CDK is that it's not CDK versus CloudFormation, because I think, again, this is where people get tripped up. CDK is a developer acceleration tool on top of CloudFormation. And it's a choice. It's not for everybody. It's about what is the fastest tool for you and your team to use. So this is CDK on the left, specifically TypeScript CDK. It allows you to define, it uses empirical code to define resources in a declarative way, is the line we've been using. So you can go in here and you can see that this is a DynamoDB table that is pay per request. It's a Lambda function that the handler is lambda.handler, and it's a node. And then it's been granted read-write on, the Lambda has been granted read-write access to the table. And then we have an API gateway, HTTP API fronting it. And it's all got comments in it. And it's just like reading any other code. That's what CDK is. At any point, if you go to deploy this, or you can just manually do CDK synth, it will produce the CloudFormation template that's on the right. And again, that's not an insult to CloudFormation, because CloudFormation is awesome. I would just like to see it be able to go back left as well. I would love to be able to start with a CloudFormation template, open it in CDK, do my thing, and then put it back to CloudFormation, and it goes both ways, but we're not there yet. It's more of a use CDK to produce CloudFormation today. And if you're just new to start out, I would definitely recommend still learning CloudFormation, because it deploys through CloudFormation. So any errors you hit in the deploy process, they're going to be a CloudFormation error. So that's where you might get frustrated if you expect to see the error in the IDE and the deploy log is a CloudFormation error and you've no experience of CloudFormation. But the good thing about it is, because it's code, like any other piece of code that you have out there, it means you can write unit tests for this. And personally, I love this, because back whenever we were doing like vanilla CloudFormation and there was a team, there was 6 of us trying to make changes to this CloudFormation template for an API gateway. And whenever you deleted something, if you've ever worked in a CloudFormation, it's not just like there's the chunk. There'll be pieces across a multi-thousand line template. So you'd be going in, deleting a couple of lines and hoping that you got the right lines, and then deploying it and hoping nothing broke. And we had many stories over people breaking CloudFormation, hitting CloudFormation drift, and it all being dramatic. Whereas with unit tests, I can write a unit test to say, this Lambda function, I expect this Lambda function to stay node 12. And you could add in your comments why, because maybe this piece of code needs refactored to be updated to a more recent version of Node, otherwise it will break. And that's where you have a unit test that'll fail, and it'll stop people from deploying changes that didn't side effects that they didn't necessarily mean. And on top of this granular testing, you can also just do a snapshot test where you can say, fail this if this infrastructure changes. So you don't have to be granular. I just like being granular. And the whole point of all of CDK being an abstraction is that it's all centered around reusable patterns. That's what CDK is. AWS is trying to create a community of reusable abstractions that help people on their journey to the cloud. And it's all based on this technology called JSII, or I saw someone say JC, so this can be the new GIF versus GIF. But this is the technology that allows you to write a CDK construct, which is just a reusable class to deploy something. You can write it in TypeScript, and then through JSII, you can publish it to all the other languages. So Python, .NET, Java, Go, and that process is all defined for you. And that's an example of it here. That's my published library for single page app deploys. It just translates it to be native as far as the consumer is concerned. And then underneath it, it uses Node still for its communication, but it's pretty cool. And then the other side of things is at the top level, you can have patterns, and that's where I've maintained sort of CDKpatterns.com, where you can pull together pieces of cloud infrastructure to solve a problem or teach a lesson. And then people can just clone them, run the unit test to check that it still works the way they expect, and then just deploy it. And anybody can contribute these things because this is what we're trying to do as a CDK community. We're trying to solve the same problems together instead of all working separately. And again, should you listen to us when it comes to CDK? Well, as mentioned at the start, I was so lucky to be part of reInvent there in December, where I got 8 minutes on stage to tell the Liberty Mutual story when it comes to CDK, as well as receive that Now Go Build award. And Werner previously quoted me in one of his, I think it was AWS Summit South America. So there's 2 links here that you can go out and you can learn more information about how we use AWS CDK. But it's safe to say we don't mandate anything in Liberty. It's a case of whatever is the most popular tool that people are productive in, they can use. And CDK has been massively popular in Liberty. It has really accelerated things. The next thing is, well, if you're talking about serverless, what about AWS SAM, which is the serverless application model? And this is a YAML-based alternative to CDK. So there's serverless resources defined in a much more succinct YAML than CloudFormation, and that's awesome. It's just another tool that's based on how your team works that can speed you up. But it's not CDK or SAM anymore. It was announced at CDK Day last year that SAM and CDK are better together, I think it was that Eric said. So any piece of functionality that exists in the SAM CLI now and going forward will be compatible with CDK. So you can combine it for things like the local testing, for the SAM Accelerator. All of these things are now being integrated with CDK. So it's a case of using whatever works best for your team. And I love hearing AWS teams working closer together. Love it. The next big elephant in the room is Terraform. And if you've never used Terraform, basically it doesn't out of the box use CloudFormation. You can get it to use CloudFormation, but it does its own state management in its own way. I've never personally used Terraform, so I'm just going to talk to you from the theory. But this is really powerful because instead of being coupled to CloudFormation, and CloudFormation typically, they have to be thoughtful whenever they add new features to CloudFormation because they don't want the API to be unstable. So when something goes into CloudFormation, it's typically there for a long time, which means you can see a new feature being released. And the APIs are there that you could hit it outside of CloudFormation, but there could be a gap before the CloudFormation support. Whereas Terraform hooks directly into the APIs, so it can use that change on day one. Plus, because it's API based, it can technically hook into anything, not just AWS. So if you have on-prem or other solutions, you can build it all in Terraform. And the idea is the state, because you're not using a managed service like CloudFormation, the state is stored, checked in with the actual infrastructure, and you can do a bunch of cool things with that. Well, there's also a CDK for Terraform. And this is where it gets really interesting because I think it's at version 1 now, I think. And the link's at the bottom, terraform.io/CDKTF. But this allows you to get the benefits of AWS CDK, but have Terraform underneath instead of CloudFormation. So it's still all those programming languages. It's still allowing you to use imperative code in a declarative way. But now you've got the power of Terraform. And it gets even more interesting. I haven't tried this, but this is where it's becoming really cool. So there's this technical preview for the AWS adapter. And this allows you to use the actual AWS CDK constructs inside a CDK for Terraform project. So why would you do this? Well, say you start a new project in AWS CDK, and all of a sudden you need to add a new resource that's outside AWS, and you were like, if only I'd used Terraform. Well, theoretically, with this, you should be able to pull that whole project in the CDKTF and then add in your extra resource, and away you go. So this is the power of CDK and everything being built off the same constructs model. We're now branching, even though people think it's lock-in, it's surprisingly not with cool things like this. So trying to bring a lot of this together then, because how do we combine AWS CDK with Well Architected going forward? Well, the first thing to point out for everybody is on CDKpatterns.com, it's still V1, but the difference between V1 and V2 is minimal. So it is like moving stuff. I just need to take the time to do it. But the idea is you can go out and do that Well Architected review. Sit down and get your advice for where you need to improve. And it might say in the operational excellence pillar, you need to work out how to do dashboarding. Well, that's okay, because you can go to cdkpatterns.com/patterns/well architected, go to that pillar and see that there's a pattern sitting right there to show you how to deploy a CloudWatch dashboard. And it's all linked through to the Well Architected logic underneath. And that's how I pair AWS CDK with Well Architected, building either tutorials or examples or blog posts based on deployable software related to the Well Architected pillars. And then the conversations are done through the review. But what about if we wanted to do actual Well Architected constructs? How do we do that at Liberty? Well, we use a tool, amongst other tools, we use a tool called Software Accelerator, which unfortunately it's not open sourced, but I'll go through some alternatives in a minute. But the idea is we've created a central place where anybody can go in and share any piece of work in software. So you can just go in, shop the store, pick the solution that you like, click, 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 and you've got a code base, a build pipeline, it's all deployed, all infrastructure is code, you're ready to go to production. And that's how we're doing it, because it's a central place to focus people on how they can reuse solutions. Now, you can't use our accelerator, unfortunately, but in open source, there is a thing called the Construct Hub. And again, this is really cool, because any CDK construct you create, especially if you create it with the JSII process, it comes all tagged. So when you publish it, it just gets automatically picked up by the Construct Hub. And in here, it's trying to do a similar thing to what our accelerator is doing, in that it surfaces all of these constructs, along with all the documentation of why you would want to use one and who physically supports it. So if it's an AWS one, it gets like a tick beside it. And then it gets even more interesting, because the Construct Hub itself has a construct that allows you to deploy this internally in your company if you wanted. It's still in beta, but theoretically you could deploy this inside your company for your internal constructs, and this could be your place to focus people, so that this is how you drive your reuse. The other official solution out there that you can take advantage of are AWS Solutions Constructs. So this, as the name implies, this is a collection of serverless patterns created by the AWS Solutions architects. I have to get my words right there. So in this sense, when it says they're well architected, I just want to be clear in case you get here and you're like, wait, what? It's well architected because it's the AWS Solutions architects who architected them, but don't go in and expect them to be related to like the pillars of the Well Architected framework. It's more a case of these exist as an example of AWS's solution architect's opinion on how you can connect to your resources. So you see them on the left, it's like ALB to Fargate, or API Gateway to Kinesis, or Lambda. They're always two resources connect together. And the idea is you put all these Lego pieces together to create an app. And theoretically, because AWS have done it, it should be well architected. But what if you want to create your own? What if you're sitting there thinking that's okay, but that doesn't work for me as a business? There's just a few pieces of advice I want to give to people about this, because the first thing is, please relate it to the Well Architected framework, because I have In my career, I have been in too many conversations with people where they tell me that their best practice is well architected. And then whenever I go in, their well architected is my technical debt. And it's not an easy conversation to have. And that's why people don't reuse, because they fear that it's not necessarily well architected, you're just calling it that. And when you take into account all of the pillars of well architected, it's about how well architected is this resource for your needs, not putting everyone at the gold-plated standard. So if you can actually relate your construct and the documentation to the level of well architected it is, that's how I can have faith that I can use it. And that's if you can pre-populate well architected reviews based on using your construct, that is gold. But on the flip side, the other thing is you can't abstract the cloud. Like you can create a construct that it's a one-liner, like the construct hub, that'll deploy an entire working solution to your account. The problem is it's deployed an entire working solution to your account. So any construct you create, understand that developers still need to understand how to operate the thing in production later. And that's why I'm saying if you relate it to the well-architected framework, all the operational excellence pillars should be there. But if you don't, then it's a case of I just have to sort of trust that you don't have a piece of it that's going to fall over every 4 hours because it's coded a particular way. And it's the same as don't forget about object-oriented best practices. Like I don't want to ever see like Liberty Mutual API Gateway, because what does that mean? I want specific descriptors for why a construct needs to exist for this. And then always remember that if you make a change to your construct, it's going to break your users. So you need to have a proper versioning strategy for these as well. But some of the cool things to do, I personally don't use it because I took way too long setting up all my pipelines myself. They're like my children. But try Progen for setting up your JSII projects, because out of the box, it gives you all the configuration to publish to all the package managers. So if you haven't paired Progen with the CDK construct yet, seriously try it. The next thing is make sure you document and test everything, because otherwise, especially if it's an inner source model where people are going to put in pull requests, it'll quickly get out of sync between what the code is and what the code does. And again, if it differs in any way, that's when people lose trust and they'll ditch your solution and start making their own. Then something I don't know if everybody uses, but they should understand when to use it. You don't always need to create a construct. So understand that CDK aspects exist. And aspects allow you to do aspect-oriented programming across your entire stack. And we use that for things like we need to tag all resources so that we have a metadata model underneath that allows us to know who deployed it, what business app it goes to, who's going to pay for it. And aspects is perfect for that rather than creating loads of constructs. So always consider what the options are out there. And then the last do is consider open source first, because if it's your problem, it might be everybody's problem. And even if 98% of it is applicable to the world with 2% for you, you could open source the 98% and then you can just extend it for you. And I think it would really help the whole community if that was the attitude we took. So now to the secret further resources I mentioned at the start. So the first thing I just want to say is if you came here and you went AWS CDK or CDK for Terraform or Progen sounds cool. I didn't even mention CDKs for Kubernetes. Well, CDK Day is coming back on the 26th of May. And right now we're looking for people to speak at it. So you've got until the 20th of April to submit talks. And the link's there, sessionize.com/CDK Day 2022. Just type CDK Day into Google and you'll get it. But what I think is amazing is this tiny dot down here, that's Pretoria, I believe. So there was people here that were at CDK Day last year, because all these orange dots are where people signed up from. I would love to see more dots around you. So that's what tell everybody you know and try and get as many people as excited as possible. But if conferences aren't your thing and you want to learn about AWS CDK, again, also okay, because we just so happen to have a book. And the book was written by me, Matthew Bonnig, Thorsten Hoger, and Sadia Bat. And what's in it is all the theory of everything you need to know about AWS CDK and how you can use it in your company. We spent several months coming together and comparing all our heads on that, as well as working with the AWS CDK team. So it's definitely the CDKbook.com. It's definitely worth checking out. But with that, that's me of everything I wanted to share in the slide deck. So I guess I can go to questions now, Q&A of what people are interested in asking.
That was great, Matt. A lot of well-architected and a lot of things people don't usually talk about, but it needs to be talked about. Especially like one of my pet peeves is that one where people say don't use VPCs or VPCs are evil, but VPCs are a very internal big part in old systems that generate a lot of revenue of revenue, but you can't just like completely throw it out and do everything serverless.
No, you got to understand the benefits of what you have out there and then talk about the right solution, as opposed to if you just always walk into the room and say, I'm going to use the most serverless solution, your business partners will get fed up very quickly with the amount of time it's going to cost you to refactor everything.
So let's open the floor for questions. You are welcome to turn on your video and then just ask your question. So now's the time. I did see one question that I'm gonna speak out loud so long from Viraj, that was asking, is there any way to use the Well Architected Framework in a CI/CD pipeline? So do you know if you can hook that up in an automated way?
So today, not really. I mean, there are tools on AWS that can give you some well-architected advice. Like there's the security advisor, and I always forget the names of them. But they're not directly hooked in to the well-architected API yet. I constantly am badgering AWS to ask them to do this. It's something I'm actively trying to work on in Liberty, but unfortunately not today.
There was one question from Mohan that asked, in a multi-region serverless deployment, should a Route 53 health check look for availability of services like S3, SQ, DynamoDB, etc. every 5 seconds? Is this the recommended approach? A Lambda executing this health check would add more cost to your bill.
Yeah, so you should have your health checks set up on your, so you can set it up that you have a health. I mean, I don't know if it go down to the level of S3, because if S3 is down, you're going to know it's down. They are, but like a lot of things you might even be able to deploy if S3 is down. But either way, you can have your health checks set up, yeah, with an automatic failover that whenever something goes down, it automatically switches over. I don't know if it go every 5 seconds. It's really down to your business needs. Like if your business is okay, if your business, I don't know, if your Google search, probably every 5 seconds. But if you're libertymutual.com and you're down for half an hour, I think that's probably okay. So it's about understanding what makes sense for what you're deploying.
And also just the question about the cost, like a Lambda function firing every 5 seconds forever will still be within the free tier. I'm pretty sure about that. So probably no costs.
Yeah, I know it's going to be minimal unless I was thinking if you've hundreds of thousands of apps deployed and they're all doing it, but no, it's going to be cheap.
Any other questions from anyone?
Hi, Matt. I'm Jake. I had a question. You showed that Software Accelerator, and I'm curious, when you guys were working through Wordly mapping, is the Software Accelerator something that helped move some things over towards being easier to develop or more of a commodity, or just if you could talk about that a little bit? Thanks for your talk today.
Yeah, so the timing was perfect with the accelerator, because I just moved roles in the architect role over like a business unit. And I was able to come in, the accelerator was just being launched, and we went through and Wordly mapped every single team. And then what you can do is you can overlay them all on top of each other, because they're all, if I do them, they're all going to be as equally incorrect, if you know what I mean. So then you can go and you can look, oh, if I built this particular pattern, it would help 40-50% of the teams, and then go and add that to the accelerator and tell people how to use it. And that's how we've been driving reuse. Instead of just telling teams the theory, we've actually been building working software, giving it to them, and asking them to go back and contribute back if it doesn't meet their needs.
It's a lot of sense. Thank you. That sounds great.
I see one more question is, Baraj is asking again if we can use CloudFormation for AWS Cloud Search, which is a service that I haven't heard in a long time. I'm not sure if CloudFormation supports Cloud Search. If it does, then the CDK probably does as well.
I don't know. I haven't deployed it myself. I'd have to go and look it up, unfortunately.
It's one of those first services like simple table of those origin services that is similar to Elasticsearch or a very toned down version of it. That's all that I know about it as well.
Yeah, it doesn't mention CloudFormation on the page, so I'm going to assume for now it's not in CloudFormation if it's one of the first ones that wasn't put in it at the time.
Hey, Matt, I wonder if you'd share a little more about how you've leveraged wordly mapping. Like, I think you just sort of touched on that a little bit, and I was going to ask about it anyway. But so it sounds like maybe you were mapping each team, and so doing the same map with each team, and then comparing those different maps. Is that? And do you have other use cases or other success stories with wordly mapping?
Yeah, like so we went through, and definitely you go through the teams and like, what's your common purpose? Who's your customer? Let's describe your value chain, and then you draw the map. But one team could have many maps because it's based on a particular path for a user. And that's where I use it as an architect to get situational awareness, because otherwise it would take a long time to phone everybody. Hey, yeah, what are you building? What's your tech? So that's where we go through every team, draw the maps. And then even if it doesn't cover all of everything, it gives you a good idea of what people are building. And it lets you spark a conversation. You can even see, oh, there's an internal service that I thought was unimportant that half of the company are now using. We should maybe invest in this thing. So we use it for situational awareness and a broadly equal brush to compare people, not in a bad way, but in a how to help you way.
Thanks, great talk.
There's another question from Audit that's asking one slide Matt mentioned the WAR constructs were made for V1, not V2. What is the parity for someone starting with CDK between version 1 and version 2? And is version 2 enough to model any app architectures in other way? How holistic is V1 versus V2?
Yeah, so V1 versus V2 mostly is to do with how the actual constructs themselves are brought into your project. Because in V1, the architectural design was that it should be as lightweight as possible. So you start with just core AWS CDK when you created a new project. And then if you thought, I want to add an API gateway, you had to go out to your package manager and install the API gateway construct. And the problem was, like, it was brilliant in terms of that it was so modular. The problem was all of the packages you brought in had to be the same version of CDK. So people would get into this situation where they'd bring one in, they'd start a project, and then a couple of weeks later bring a new one in. CDK had updated a version, and it would run into these weird scenarios where you'd hit node errors, and you get rid of it by just deleting node modules and reinstalling most of the time. But it was a problem for enough users that they re-architected how you bring in dependencies. So now they created mono CDK, as they call it. So every construct that's an official construct that's not experimental is bundled by default. And then the experimental ones you can bring in, but it's a manual choice. And the reason why they did that was because in V1, people said they didn't understand. It wasn't clear if the construct they were using was experimental or stable. And then there could be churn because if it's experimental, the API can change. So long story saying, a V1 actual app could be identical to a V2 app, bar a couple of lines of code. It's really to do with how you manage your dependencies. Now, if you're starting today, I would definitely start with V2. It's just a case of, don't write off V1 examples because you can probably still pull all of the code except for the package.json, and it should be good with V2.
We have just another question about Progen. So is Progen a monorepo, and what is the best way to use a monorepo with the CDK? I think that one's a bit open-ended, but maybe if you have some advice.
Yeah, so ProGen itself is just a way of generating all your configuration for like for anything. It's what did Alad call it? A CDK of CDKs or something. But yeah, the way behind it is you say, I want a CDK construct. And it could just be one. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monorepo of like 5 or 6 constructs. You can set it up whatever way you want. It's down to you. But instead of you having to maintain all the package.json and all the Jest setup and all of the specific configuration split across all these different files, it's an abstraction that allows you to just maintain it in the ProGen file. And it just rebuilds all those files for you the same way CDK builds CloudFormation. So it makes it, in theory, a lot easier to keep these things up to date over time. But yeah, it's ProGen can go monorepo or not monorepo. It's really up to what you and your team want to do.